James Cameron's Titanic is a great movie, despite what most people might say on the internet. It has an amazing soundtrack, great action scenes, and is incredibly detailed down to the smallest of things. However, one thing to note is that the Titanic movie isn't a historical documentary. Rather, it's an artistic piece that is based on a real-life historical event. While the movie does include some historically accurate elements, at the end of the day, its primary goal is to tell an exciting story, whether or not it respects the original source material. Because of this, there are some scenes in the film that, in reality, never actually happened. With that being said, let's take a look at James Cameron's Titanic and see just what exactly is historically inaccurate. At the beginning of the movie, we are introduced to an elderly Rose, who reminisces about her fateful voyage above the RMS Titanic. As the scene gradually shifts, we see enthusiastic crowds waving goodbye as the largest and most luxurious ship ever built sets sail on its maiden voyage. The Titanic, shining with pride and surrounded by fanfare, speedfully departs from Southampton before the eyes of thousands of onlookers. As iconic and amazing as this scene was, it's completely wrong. Historically, it never actually happened at all. Contrary to popular belief, while she was afloat, Titanic wasn't a popular ship. In reality, not that many people cared about her until she slammed into the ocean floor 2.5 miles below the water. However, that didn't mean Titanic wasn't a remarkable ship. At the time, she was in fact the largest man-made object afloat and was also one of the most luxurious ships any person could book a trip on. However, on the day of her maiden voyage, she only attracted a handful of onlookers and set off with very little commotion. This was due to a multitude of reasons, but by far the biggest was the fact that the Titanic was not a unique ship. Instead, she was the second built of 3 ships in the Olympic class. The RMS Olympic was the first of the 3 launched and entered service in 1911, nearly a whole year before the Titanic. Since Olympic and Titanic were sister ships, their designs were almost identical. Apart from a handful of quality of life changes, things like the grand staircase, first-class smoking room, gymnasium, and dozens upon dozens of other things were exactly the same. In other words, when Titanic had her maiden voyage on April 10, 1912, most of the general public really didn't care. Many people had already seen the Olympic's massive size and luxurious accommodations a whole year prior, so to them, the Titanic was just the other ship, a boring old duplicate. Historically speaking, the scenes in the movie where people are cheering as the ship leaves port, or dialogue like,
"It doesn't look any bigger than the Mauritania."
You could be blasé about some things, Rose, but not about Titanic. It's over 100 feet longer than Mauritania, and far more luxurious.
Wouldn't have been of the Titanic, but instead of the Olympic. On top of that, Titanic wasn't even transporting her full complement of passengers. In the movie, Titanic's hallways, decks, and various other rooms were packed to the brim with people. In real life, however, Titanic carried a little over 2,000 people on her maiden voyage, around 60% of her maximum capacity. That number, believe it or not, was supposed to be even smaller. In 1912, coal miners in Britain staged a coal strike, halting all mining operations and demanding a higher wage for their work. Because of this, many ships in Southampton didn't have enough coal to cross the Atlantic. White Star Line, the owner and operator of Titanic, not wanting to delay the maiden voyage of their new ship, decided to strike a deal with many of these other liners. In exchange for their coal, Titanic would take their passengers across the ocean to New York. Another historically inaccurate sequence in James Cameron's Titanic was the boiler room scenes, specifically when the ship strikes the iceberg. In the movie, the scene plays out like this. As the iceberg pierces its way through the hull of the ship, enormous amounts of frigid seawater starts flooding into the various compartments, washing away anything in its path. Realizing that the ship is in danger, the bridge immediately pulls the switch to engage the bulkhead doors. As alarms in each watertight compartment go off, the large immovable doors gradually start to make the descent, attempting to drag any unfortunate soul to their watery grave. Up to their knees in freezing water, men in the boiler room scramble through the doors to safety. While some barely make it through, others find themselves trapped on the other side with no way out. As all the watertight doors close, a blanket of uneasiness fills the ship as the large and menacing block of ice floats off into the distance. This scene, as you may have already guessed, is very dramatized. Almost everything you see portrayed in the movie most definitely did not happen in real life. For starters, when the Titanic hit the iceberg, it didn't tear a massive hole into the side of the ship. Instead, it made a series of small punctures along 5 watertight compartments. Frankly, if the ship took on this much water at one time, it would have easily sank within the first couple of minutes rather than a few hours. Additionally, the men in the boiler rooms weren't scrambling for their lives to get through the closing bulkhead doors. In the movie, the filmmakers treat the doors as if they were the only way in and out of the boiler rooms, going as far as to show a fireman freaking out that he couldn't make it through. In reality, the bulkhead doors closing wasn't an automatic death sentence for anyone in the boiler rooms. If anything, it might have been more of a mild inconvenience. If any of the boiler crew needed to evacuate, they would simply just climb up and out onto E-deck. Each boiler room had its own set of stairs and ladders that traveled upwards around the massive boilers, of which the crew could use to escape. On top of that, the bulkhead doors themselves were also depicted sort of incorrectly in the movie. In real life, once the doors came about 1 to 2 feet before closing, they would free fall the rest of the way down and slam into a slot on the ground. This was done to create a watertight seal between the bulkheads and would have easily cut off this guy's leg if he had been on the real ship. Furthermore, the doors could be manually opened by crew in the boiler rooms, which was done to both rescue a lost crewmate and to also bring suction hoses to the flooded areas of the ship. While nobody was unintentionally trapped in the boiler rooms, many of the workers in the lower areas of the ship unfortunately did not survive. Something James Cameron's Titanic doesn't show too much of was the multitudes of engineers and crew that risked their lives in trying to save the ship. From firing the boilers to keep the lights on throughout the ship, to working the pumps to drain out the water, it's estimated that their sacrifices kept the Titanic afloat for over an hour longer than originally expected. By keeping the ship afloat and the lights running, hundreds of lives that might have previously been lost were saved that day. In the end, James Cameron's Titanic has quite a few historically inaccurate things. Believe it or not, this video only covers a handful of issues with the movie. There are dozens upon dozens of other things that are wrong depending on how much you want to nitpick. Many people will say that this movie is bland, overly dramatic, bad, and so on. And honestly, I understand where they're coming from. On top of being very historically inaccurate, the characters lack any sort of nuance, the plot is very cookie cutter, the romance is flattered in the cutting board, etc. and etc. However, despite all of that, I still do believe James Cameron's movie is great. You see, James Cameron's Titanic did something that no other Titanic movie before or after has been able to do, inspiring a whole new generation of kids, teens, and adults to get interested in history. Up until 1997, outside of a few crazy fans, most people only knew Titanic as that one ship that sank from hitting an iceberg. After the movie came out, people immediately became interested in the lore around Titanic and her passenger stories, along with various other subjects. To this day, most people in the ocean liner community, including myself, originally became interested in ocean liners and history because of the Titanic movie. History, despite what most people will say, is incredibly important to learn and preserve. It gives us context, changes our worldviews, and encourages us to think critically. Overall, I don't think James Cameron's Titanic is a great movie because of its stories or characters, but instead of what it was able to accomplish outside of the silver screen.